Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Straight Outta Compton. It's weird to see a movie like Straight Outta Compton because it's named after probably one of my favorite albums of all time. It's an album I absolutely love. It's considered one of the greatest rap albums ever made, and it's probably one of the most influential rap albums ever made. There's a ferocity to it. There's an energy to it that no album could really replicate. It's an amazing album that I love to put on. Sometimes I can't even handle the energy of the first two tracks. I can't get into it sometimes. Sometimes I just start with track 3 because the first two tracks are so explosive. Straight Outta Compton, then Fuck the Police. It is pure rebellion and rebellion against oppression in a way that no other rap album was really able to encapsulate as well as Straight Outta Compton, and it really has a lot to do with rebellious youth. I think that's one of the reasons why that album in particular and N.W.A have lived on, represents that fuck you attitude. And seeing that become a typical biopic studio picture is a weird thing. And because not just N.W.A, but Dr. Dre and Ice Cube were both people whose albums I listened to quite frequently when I was growing up. It's weird to see some group that was very anti-establishment in effect make a movie that's very establishment. And I'd say that for the second half, it definitely fulfills that role that you expect from a biopic. The first half of this movie has so much energy to it. It reminds me of listening to Straight Outta Compton. It's such a great picture of a group getting together and why they wrote those songs and why they wanted to get together and the desperate situation they were in. It's an energy that you can only really see from hip-hop movies. You look at Hustle and Flow or 8 Mile, and I think more so Hustle and Flow because it just gave you that energy like you wanted to lay down a track. Even if maybe you couldn't, or the rhymes would suck and wouldn't be as good as anything in either of those movies, it gives you the energy like you need to. You feel like anything is possible if you do because of the energy that's rubbed off from this film. Straight Outta Compton has 2 parts. It's probably not actually structured in like part 1 and part 2, but while you're watching it, it actually feels that way. We'll say part 1 is everything from before the formation of N.W.A until Ice Cube quits the group. And that is a really solid movie. It has a great energy to it. It shows everything from how rebellious they were, the area they lived in, an amazing opening sequence where Eazy-E is in a drug deal gone bad and he has to escape while the cops raid the place, which almost feels like it's from a different movie, this crazy action sequence, but it really gives you the dystopian reality of the post-crack Compton, California that was going on at the time. It kind of just sets you in that world. They don't really need to show it to you over and over again. They showed it to you, and that scene's very memorable and does its job very well. They move on and you meet everyone and you understand how they all met. You understand how Dr. Dre knew Ice Cube and how DJ Yella got involved and MC Ren. Those 2 aren't really the focus points of the movie. They really focus on the 3 people you think of when you think of N.W.A, which is Ice Cube, Eazy-E, and Dr. Dre. Although I think MC Ren actually did contribute a fair amount, and I wish him and DJ Yella got a little more attention, but they don't. As they say, history is written by the winners, and the winners are producing this movie. Through watching them form the group and seeing them tour and seeing them become very successful and doing something different from the style of rap that was going on at the time. Most of rap was going on in New York, but it was kind of more party rap, was stuff people could dance to, and this was like hood reality stuff. It'd been done slightly before, but not to this extent and not as successful. And showing them on tour and the problems with the FBI and them getting their manager, Jerry Heller, excellently played by Paul Giamatti. One concert, all these cops come and arrest them during the concert, and it's this big amazing scene, and you're like, oh my god, they stood up to these cops when they told them they couldn't perform Fuck the Police, and they did it anyway, and now they get arrested, and it's like all this crazy stuff, and it's this amazing sequence. And then when Ice Cube won't sign his contract and leaves the group, the movie becomes your standard biopic. Everything before in part 1 really, that's more about N.W.A forming and their rebellious attitude, these kids from Compton becoming one of the biggest rap groups in the world, was amazing and probably one of the greatest hip-hop movies I've seen in a long time. If that was all there was, everyone would be hailing how awesome this movie was and how great of a job F. Gary Gray did. But the rest of it just feels like your standard almost TV movie biopic. The energy of the first one was so amazing, and it was kind of like on air after. I was in such an amazing energetic mood after watching the first half that I kind of almost like let the second half go for a while, but eventually that goodwill is ruined because you do feel like you're just going from, oh, we'll go from the diss tracks back and forth, but they don't get into Dre Day, Dr. Dre and Eazy-E going back and forth. They just do N.W.A. going against Ice Cube and Ice Cube doing his diss track, and they don't really get into specifics after that. It felt like everything was Straight Outta Compton. We really understood how certain rhymes were written. We understood where certain songs came from. We understood where ideas came from. We got the idea as an audience. We understood as an audience how that happened. And suddenly, after the diss track stuff, as it kept going on, we get less and less specifics. So from a storytelling angle, the problem with Straight Outta Compton is at the beginning it feels more about the character. It's more about this group. We understand how each thing is happening and why they're doing it. And then suddenly we kind of get glimpses of things. We get Snoop Dogg coming in to do 187. We have just a glimpse of Tupac for some reason. When we don't actually see the Chronic being made, we see Dr. Dre kind of coming up with Nothing But a G thing, but you don't really get him in the studio making the Chronic. You're getting the broad strokes, but it's then leaving out things that you think a traditional biopic would go, oh, well, we have to have this scene in because this is the Blanksy Blank movie. And in the N.W.A. movie, it's weird because they don't get into the specifics of Ice Cube after America's Most Wanted. They don't go into like the Predator and the EPs all these guys made and all the other albums. The most you get of the Chronic is a billboard that Eazy-E sees as he's driving by. You're not understanding where that's coming from. You don't even actually get a specifics of Eiffel for Zaggin, the second N.W.A. album. They just kind of talk about it a little bit, but they don't stay on it. The second part goes up until after Eazy-E's death and Dr. Dre leaving Death Row. They kind of talk about how N.W.A. was talking about getting back together. The thing about this movie is the first half is so good and the second half is so standard. I actually think the first half is better than any of the Oscar biopics I saw last year. It has such a great energy to it and it's almost like inspiring in a way, in that kind of fake biopic-y way, but it's still inspiring nonetheless. The second half is more about contracts and money and showing off how successful they are and leaving off all the women Dr. Dre beat up, just giving you glimpses of things but not getting into the specifics. The second part is not as thrilling and it's not as inspired. And you almost wonder, well, why did you include it? Like, why have all that? Why is half the N.W.A. movie about all of the solo careers that happened in the 90s rather than just N.W.A.? I kind of think this movie would have been a lot better if it had just been the story of N.W.A. and like the end of the movie had been like Dr. Dre quitting N.W.A. That would have been a better movie and then we would have had less of the movie that didn't really work. And also because Death Row is kind of like its own thing in itself, and trying to even get into that nonsense, that's a different movie. There could be a movie about Death Row Records. The interesting thing is Dr. Dre and Ice Cube almost don't make themselves as interesting and as complex, and they gloss over certain things. You don't really get as complex the characters. They don't really get into the complexities of them. But the Eazy-E relationship with Jerry Heller feels like there's more complexity in that. And it's interesting, like his widow, who is a producer, probably could have done the same thing, but doesn't. And so Eazy-E actually comes off a little more complex because of his financial troubles, because of him getting HIV. He becomes kind of the character who I was more interested in, because Dr. Dre, it's like, oh, Dr. Dre's successful and Suge Knight sucks. Wow, that's a complex situation. And then Ice Cube, it's like, oh, Ice Cube's very successful and fights his record label and wins. Wow, that's a thing. But Eazy-E feels like he has some problems. He has some issues. He's the more compelling character to watch. The one thing about the more traditional biopics I mentioned before is they pick and choose things that you'd expect them to pick and choose. The N.W.A. biopic, after a certain point, is just like kind of randomly picking things and not really being specific. And this movie is also like 140 minutes long. It is already pretty long, and it's almost weird to do as much material as they do. I remember reading apparently Disney was considering doing a Walt Disney biopic, and they realized to really cover all the material it'd have to be this epic mini-series. And to cover like all these guys' lives who are so important to not just hip-hop culture and music culture, but just culture in general and pop culture. It feels like maybe just the story of N.W.A. was more suitable for a movie, but trying to cover Death Row Records and everything they did in the early 90s just feels like too much. Maybe that's why the first part is so much better written, because they're just picking a certain part of history. You know, that's probably why I like Selma more than I like Imitation Game and The Theory of Everything. It's hard to do someone's whole life in a movie, much like the whole point of Citizen Kane. You're not really going to know much about that person from someone's life condensed into 2 hours. And with Straight Outta Compton, you're not really going to understand the 90s. You're not really going to understand what went on throughout that, because they're bumping around between different things. But if you tell a specific story of their life, it works more for the framework of a movie. Maybe that's also why the first part works so well. A lot of the actors in this film don't really have that many credits to their name. O'Shea Jackson Jr., who is Ice Cube's oldest son, I believe, he plays Ice Cube, and he does a really great job. There's certain points where, especially after Ice Cube shaves his head, he looks exactly like his dad, and there's certain shots that I honestly did double takes. It was just really remarkable. He does a good job of kind of both hero worshipping his dad and emulating him very well. I like all the performance, especially Corey Hawkins as Dr. Dre. Neil Brown Jr. as DJ Yellow almost plays like the weird like sidekick. Aldous Hodge, I think, is MC Ren. But I think Jason Mitchell as Eazy-E is really the standout of this movie. I would love to see him in other stuff. He really went for it, and it's probably the most Oscar-y of all the performances in this film. And Jerry Heller, who's played by Paul Giamatti. Paul Giamatti is absolutely perfect. Eventually he just becomes like the evil manager type and whatever, and that's super lame. But much of the first part you kind of get like why him and Eazy are friends, how they get along, that relationship. Straight Outta Compton isn't a lot like your typical biopic, because it gives you some hope and it gives you some faith in this movie, and it makes you think that they made a really awesome N.W.A. movie that will make you get up from your seat and scream fuck the police, especially because there's a cop right outside the theater who kept coming in all the time, and that was really annoying. It gives you that rebellious nature. It makes you feel that danger that I used to feel when I'd listen to gangster rap, and that fun, and they're like, I can't believe these guys are getting away with this. It felt like a good film about a bunch of young guys getting together and putting on a show and standing up for what they believed in, and finally saying what needed to be said. The first part of this movie is the hip-hop movie that we need in cinemas. It's the hip-hop movie that people want. It shows how a rap group came together, and I wish more hip-hop movies were like that. The second half is a boring biopic. It's so typical and predictable, but I'm just gonna think about how much I love the first half of that, and how I'm probably going to re-download Straight Outta Compton and listen to it a million times like I did before. It is a sign of the times that N.W.A. gets a biopic, and it's a major release, and it's a big deal. And now I'm Wikipediaing everybody in the group and thinking about all these albums, and it does make me think about how I knew so many baby boomers who bought the Forrest Gump soundtrack and were re-looking up things. And it's sadly predictable, but I still like this movie quite a bit, and I still had a really good time with it. And I haven't had a great time with the biopic, and I frankly fucking hate biopics, and I wasn't expecting much. It's so odd to see a movie that has such a great first half and such a predictable second half, and that's kind of sad, but the first half is so good I almost want to forgive it. You'll at least leave with a film that'll leave you entertained and buzzing out of the theater, just because probably of that first half, and thinking about how amazing it was that these guys went from this to that. It does that better than a lot of biopics do. It's not that deep, but what biopics really are. At least it tried and succeeded to be something more, even if it fell apart and became that predictable biopic thing that's become completely cliche-ridden. I still was leaving the theater thinking about that first half, and thinking about how strong it was when Ice Cube yelled out Straight Outta Compton, and that amazing, frenetic, crazy energy that just explodes off your speaker in your headphones. So if you have seen Straight Outta Compton and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.